The sun was setting over the city skyline as a distinguished-looking man in his mid-50s adjusted his bow tie in his office mirror. The courthouse was nearly empty now, with just the fading echoes of the day's proceedings lingering in the halls. He had spent the entire day presiding over a complex civil rights case, and his tired eyes reflected both wisdom and wariness. As a federal judge for the past 15 years, he had earned every gray hair that now peppered his temples. His colleagues often joked that he practically lived in his chambers, and today was no different. The wall clock showed 7:30 p.m. Another late evening at work. The judge gathered his worn leather briefcase, filled with case files he planned to review over the weekend. The weight of responsibility never seemed to lighten, but he wouldn't have it any other way. His passion for justice had only grown stronger over the years, shaped by both his professional experience and personal encounters with prejudice. Walking through the courthouse parking garage, his footsteps echoed against the concrete walls. His black Mercedes, a reward he'd finally allowed himself after years of hard work, sat waiting in its reserved spot. The car wasn't just a symbol of success, it was his small reminder that he had overcome countless obstacles to reach this position. The evening air was crisp with early autumn chill as he pulled out onto the street. The city was transforming from its daytime bustle to its quieter nighttime persona. Streetlights were flickering to life, and the sidewalks were thinning out as people headed home for dinner. He let his mind wander to the weekend ahead. Maybe he'd finally have time to finish reading that new legal biography on his nightstand. Classical music played softly through his car speakers as he navigated the familiar route home. He had taken these same streets countless times, past the local shops, the neighborhood park, and the elementary school where he sometimes spoke to students about law and justice. The routine drive usually helped him decompress from the day's tensions. But tonight would be different. As he turned onto the tree-lined residential street just 10 minutes from his house, he noticed something in his rearview mirror that made his heart sink, the distinct flash of red and blue lights. Despite his position, despite his achievements, despite the respect he'd earned in the legal community, that flash of lights triggered a familiar feeling of dread. He knew the drill all too well, not from his years on the bench, but from his experiences as a black man in America. His hands instinctively moved to the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel as he carefully pulled over to the curb. The classical music that had been soothing his nerves now seemed jarringly out of place. Taking a deep breath, he reached for his wallet, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. Through his side mirror, he could see the police officer approaching, flashlight beam bouncing with each step. Years of legal experience told him this stop was likely without probable cause, but decades of life experience told him to stay calm and collected. The judge's mind wasn't on his title or position now. He was thinking about the countless similar situations he'd heard about in his courtroom, the testimonies of racial profiling that had become all too familiar. But tonight, he wasn't presiding over these stories, he was living one. And as the officer's footsteps grew closer, he knew that what happened next would test not just his patience, but his deep-rooted belief in the possibility of positive change in the justice system. The beam of the flashlight suddenly flooded his car interior, momentarily blinding him. The next few minutes would prove to be a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone involved in what was about to unfold. Little did anyone know, this seemingly routine traffic stop would soon become a story that would challenge perspectives and inspire change in ways no one could have predicted. The police lights painted everything in alternating flashes of red and blue, creating strange shadows across the peaceful suburban street. The judge watched through his side mirror as the officer stepped out of his patrol car. He was young, probably in his early 30s, with a rigid posture that seemed to broadcast authority with every step. Time seemed to slow down as the officer approached. The judge could hear the crunch of boots on fallen autumn leaves, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, and his own steady breathing as he kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. He taught his own son these same careful movements years ago, a lesson no parent should have to give, but one that remained necessary. The beam from the officer's flashlight swept across the car's interior, lingering on the judge's hands, then his face, then the leather briefcase on the passenger seat. The light was unnecessarily bright, making the judge squint slightly. He noticed how the officer's other hand rested near his holster, a detail that didn't escape his trained eye. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the evening air. There was no greeting, no explanation for the stop, just the cold command that made the judge's jaw tighten slightly. Even after all these years, after all his accomplishments, moments like these could still make him feel like a teenager again, being stopped for the first time. As the judge reached, slowly, deliberately, for his wallet, he caught the officer's subtle flinch. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket," he said calmly, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in his courtroom. The officer's flashlight followed his every movement, creating dancing shadows across the car's leather interior. "Is there a problem, officer?" the judge asked, his voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in his stomach. The question hung in the air for a moment, unanswered. Instead, the officer began firing off his own questions. "Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Is this your car?" Each question came rapid fire, like bullets from a gun, each one loaded with unspoken assumptions. The judge noticed how the officer's eyes darted between him and the expensive car, how his expression held a hint of disbelief. He'd seen that look before, both in his personal life and in countless testimonies in his courtroom. The judge's hand trembled slightly as he pulled out his wallet, not from fear, but from a deep, controlled anger at the familiar scene playing out once again. His credentials were tucked neatly inside, including his federal judge ID that had opened many doors, but ironically, couldn't seem to prevent moments like these. "I'm coming from the federal courthouse," he replied, his voice carrying just a hint of his position's authority. "I've been there all day, presiding over cases." He handed over his license and registration, knowing that the next few moments would likely change the entire tone of this encounter. The flashlight beam caught the gold judicial badge in his wallet, making it gleam momentarily. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he processed what he was seeing. The change in his demeanor wasn't dramatic, just a supple shift in posture, a slight lowering of the flashlight, but it was there. Yet instead of backing down, the officer seemed to double down. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he said, his voice now carrying a hint of uncertainty masked by forced authority. It was as if he was too far committed to his initial approach to change course, even as he realized his mistake. The judge took a deep breath, feeling the weight of this moment. He knew his next actions would matter, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever faced similar treatment. This wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about something much bigger, something that needed to change. And sometimes, change started with moments exactly like this one. The street had grown quieter now, with only the soft hum of the judge's car engine and the crackling of the police radio breaking the silence. A few curious neighbors had begun peeking through their curtains, drawn by the flashing lights that continued to paint the peaceful neighborhood in surreal colors. "I'd prefer to stay in my vehicle," the judge replied calmly, his voice carrying years of courtroom authority. "Unless you can state your probable cause for this stop and subsequent search request." He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, his wedding ring catching the flashlight's beam as he spoke. The officer shifted his weight, clearly thrown off by the judge's knowledge of legal procedure. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle," he repeated, his voice trying to maintain control, but betraying a hint of uncertainty. His hand was still hovering near his holster, a detail that made the judge's heart beat faster despite his outward calm. Several thoughts raced through the judge's mind. He thought about his son in law school, about the conversations they'd had about moments exactly like this. He thought about the countless cases he presided over where similar scenarios had played out with far worse endings. Right now, he had a choice to make, one that could either escalate or transform the situation. "Officer," he began, his tone shifting to what his colleagues called his teaching voice, "I'm going to reach for my phone and call your supervisor." The statement wasn't a threat. It was delivered with the same calm authority he used when instructing young law clerks. "I believe we need a third party present to ensure this situation is handled properly." The officer's radio crackled to life, filling the tense silence with static and coded messages. More red and blue lights appeared in the distance, backup arriving even though no call had been made. The judge recognized this as standard procedure when stopping someone in this neighborhood, a thought that added another layer of sadness to his growing frustration. A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining a respectful distance but watching intently. The judge could feel their eyes on him, on his car, on the young officer who seemed increasingly unsure of his next move. Some had their phones out, recording the scene, a modern-day safeguard that had become all too necessary. The backup arrived, 2 more patrol cars pulling up behind the first. The judge watched in his mirrors as 3 more officers stepped out, including a supervisor with stripes on their sleeve. The situation had quickly become much bigger than a simple traffic stop, but then again, it had never really been simple to begin with. "My supervisor's already here," the first officer said, trying to regain control of the situation, but his voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like embarrassment. The supervisor was approaching now, reading the scene with experienced eyes. The judge took this moment to speak, his voice carrying clearly through the night air. "I'd like to know the reason for this stop," he said, addressing both officers now. "And I'd like it noted that I've been cooperative while asserting my constitutional rights." Years of legal experience flowed into each word, transforming what could have been a confrontation into a teachable moment. The supervisor reached the window, quickly taking in the judge's credentials that the first officer was still holding. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. But the judge wasn't interested in the usual backpedaling that came with these revelations. He had a greater purpose in mind. "I think," he said, looking directly at the first officer, "we have an opportunity here. Not for confrontation, but for conversation." His words carried weight, not from his position or title, but from the truth they held. What happens next could either reinforce old patterns or help break them. The growing crowd of onlookers, the assembled officers, even the gentle autumn breeze, everything seemed to pause, waiting to see how this moment would unfold. Sometimes, the biggest changes start in the smallest moments, on quiet suburban streets, between people willing to bridge the gaps that divide them. The supervisor examined the judge's credentials under the harsh beam of the flashlight, their expression shifting from professional concern to dawning recognition. Around them, the neighborhood had become unnaturally quiet, as if the whole street was holding its breath. Even the crickets seemed to have paused their evening song. "Your Honor," the supervisor said, their voice carrying a mix of respect and dismay. "I apologize for this inconvenience." But the judge raised his hand slightly, the same gesture he used in court when he wanted to make an important point. He wasn't interested in quick apologies or easy dismissals. This moment deserved more. "Let's talk about what brought us here," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "Not just tonight, but the bigger picture." He finally turned off his car engine, a simple action that somehow made the moment feel more intimate, more real. The first officer was still standing there, his earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. Through his side mirror, the judge could see phones still recording, witnesses to a scene playing out differently than many expected. He thought about all the similar videos he'd seen, the ones that ended in tragedy or outrage. But tonight could be different. Tonight could matter in a way that went beyond a single traffic stop. "Officer," he addressed the younger policeman directly, "you haven't yet told me why you pulled me over." His tone wasn't accusatory, it was the same patient voice he used when mentoring young lawyers. "Let's start there, and then we can discuss what assumptions might have influenced your decision." The young officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his flashlight beam wavering slightly. "The vehicle matched a description," he began, but his voice trailed off as he realized how weak the explanation sounded. The supervisor winced slightly, knowing how often that phrase appeared in questionable police reports. The judge nodded thoughtfully, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "A description," he repeated, not unkindly. "You know, I've heard that phrase countless times in my courtroom. But tonight, I'm not sitting on the bench. I'm sitting in my car, experiencing what so many others have experienced." A cool breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. The judge glanced at his watch. It had only been 15 minutes since he was first pulled over, but it felt like hours. Sometimes the most important moments in life happened in the smallest intervals of time. "I'd like to make a suggestion," the judge continued, his voice taking on the tone he used when proposing solutions in difficult cases. "Instead of filing a complaint or letting this become another viral video, why don't we turn this into something constructive?" The supervisor stepped forward, clearly relieved at the direction the conversation was taking. But the judge kept his attention on the young officer, seeing in his face the struggle between pride, embarrassment, and the first glimmers of understanding. Tomorrow morning, I'm presiding over a case involving police conduct and community relations, the judge explained. I'd like you to sit in on the proceedings, not as a defendant or witness, but as an observer. Sometimes we need to see ourselves from a different perspective to understand the impact of our actions. The gathered crowd had grown quieter, straining to hear this unexpected turn of events. A few had lowered their phones, sensing they were witnessing something more meaningful than another confrontational video. This was becoming a moment of transformation rather than conflict. The young officer looked at his supervisor, then back at the judge. His face showed a mix of emotions, relief, shame, and something else, perhaps the recognition that he was being offered an opportunity rather than a punishment. "Yes, sir," he said finally, his voice carrying a new note of respect that had nothing to do with the judge's title. The red and blue lights finally stopped flashing, returning the street to its normal evening glow. The supervisor was now standing beside the young officer, both listening intently as the judge spoke. The tension in the air had transformed into something different, not quite comfortable, but charged with possibility. "Before we end this encounter," the judge said, reaching slowly for his briefcase, "I want to share something with you." He pulled out a worn leather folder, its edges softened by years of use. Inside was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age but carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. "This is from 30 years ago," he explained, holding it where both officers could see. The headline told a story similar to tonight's. Another traffic stop, another misunderstanding, another moment of prejudice. But in that case, the ending had been very different. This was my first case as a young lawyer, defending a man who wasn't as fortunate as I am to have a title that commands respect. The young officer leaned in slightly, his face illuminated by the street lamp. The newspaper photo showed a much younger version of the judge, standing on the courthouse steps, his face full of determination. The article detailed how that case had helped change local police procedures, though clearly not enough. A few of the neighbors who had been watching stepped closer, drawn by the story unfolding before them. One older resident nodded in recognition. He'd been there during those earlier days, had seen the changes that came slowly, too slowly, to their community. Tomorrow's case, the judge continued, carefully returning the clipping to his briefcase, isn't just about police conduct. It's about how we see each other, how we make split-second decisions based on assumptions we might not even realize we're making. His words carried the weight of personal experience, of years spent on both sides of the law. The supervisor spoke up, their voice thoughtful. "Your Honor, would it be possible for more of our officers to attend tomorrow's session?" The question revealed an understanding that this moment could be more than just damage control. It could be an opportunity for real change. A small smile crossed the judge's face. "The more, the better," he replied. "But I want to be clear, this isn't about shame or punishment. It's about understanding. About seeing how these moments affect real people, real communities." He gestured to the gathered neighbors, the phones still recording, the quiet street that had become an unexpected classroom. The young officer straightened his posture, no longer the aggressive figure who had first approached the car. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying a new note of sincerity, "I would like to apologize properly." But again, the judge raised his hand. "Sacred for tomorrow," he said kindly. "Tonight, I want you to go home and think about what happened here. Think about how this could have gone differently, better or worse. Think about the power you hold in your uniform and the responsibility that comes with it." The gathered crowd had begun to disperse, but not with the usual angry murmurs that followed such encounters. Instead, there was a sense of having witnessed something important. A moment when change didn't come through violence or viral videos, but through wisdom and willingness to learn. The supervisor began directing the other officers to clear the scene. The judge started his car engine again, but before putting the vehicle in drive, he rolled down his window one last time. "One more thing," he called to the young officer. "When you come tomorrow, bring that description you mentioned, the one that made you stop my car. Let's talk about it, really talk about it." The officer nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the request. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came not from confrontation, but from conversation. As the judge finally drove away, the street returned to its quiet evening routine, but something had shifted. In this small corner of the city, on this ordinary night, A seed of change had been planted. The next morning arrived with a crisp autumn chill and a sky so blue it seemed to promise new beginnings. The courthouse steps were already busy with the usual morning crowd. Lawyers clutching coffee cups, clerks rushing with armfuls of files, and citizens arriving for various hearings. But today felt different. The young officer from last night stood at the bottom of the steps, now in his formal uniform rather than patrol gear. He'd arrived 20 minutes early, holding a thin folder that contained the vehicle description he used as his reason for the traffic stop. His hands fidgeted with the folder's edges, betraying his nervousness. To his surprise, he wasn't alone. Word had spread quickly through the department, and nearly 24 officers had shown up for today's proceedings. Some came out of curiosity, others from a genuine desire to learn, and a few probably just to see what would happen to their colleague. They gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about last night's events. Inside his chambers, the judge was preparing for the day's session. He'd spent the early morning hours modifying his approach to today's case, knowing he had an unexpected but important audience. His clerk brought in the morning's paperwork, pausing briefly to mention the number of police officers gathering in the courtroom. "Good," the judge said simply, straightening his robes. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when a moment had the potential for real impact. Today wasn't just about the case on the docket, it was about something bigger, something that had started on a quiet street the night before. The courtroom filled quickly. The usual audience of lawyers and defendants was joined by the large group of police officers, creating an unusual mix of uniforms and suits. The young officer from last night sat in the front row, still clutching his folder, his back straight, but his eyes showing a mix of anxiety and determination. As the judge entered, the traditional "all rise" called out across the room. Looking out at the gathered crowd, he saw more than just a courtroom full of people. He saw an opportunity. The morning's case involved a community organization suing the city over police patrol practices in minority neighborhoods. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The proceedings began normally enough, but the judge's questioning took on a special significance. Each time an issue of bias or procedure came up, he would pause, allowing the words to sink in. He noticed the young officer taking notes, his pen moving quickly across a small notepad. During the testimony of a community leader, the judge asked questions that echoed last night's encounter. "Can you explain how these routine stops affect daily life in your neighborhood?" The answer painted a vivid picture of fear, frustration, and broken trust, feelings that now had fresh meaning for at least one person in the room. Halfway through the morning, during a brief recess, the judge noticed something remarkable. The young officer had turned to an elderly black man sitting next to him, a community elder there to support the plaintiffs, and struck up a conversation. Their quiet discussion, heads bent together over the officer's notepad, seemed to represent everything the judge had hoped might come from this situation. The case itself was complex, dealing with statistics, policies, and legal precedents. But the human element, the real stories of people affected by these policies, took center stage. The judge made sure every officer in the room heard not just the legal arguments, but the human cost of biased policing. As the morning session drew to a close, the judge saw something change in the faces before him. The defensive postures had softened. The skeptical expressions had turned thoughtful. Even some of the officers who had come expecting a lecture on police misconduct were leaning forward, engaged in something more meaningful than they'd anticipated. The young officer stayed in his seat as others began filing out for lunch break. His folder lay open on his lap, the vehicle description now covered in his own handwritten notes. His face showed the kind of deep thought that comes when someone's worldview begins to shift, when old certainties start to give way to new understandings. During the lunch break, the courthouse cafeteria buzzed with unusual energy. The young officer sat alone at first, picking at his sandwich while reviewing his morning notes. His isolation didn't last long, though. The judge, having removed his robes, appeared with his own lunch tray and asked to join him. Other officers and courthouse regulars watched with interest as the two men, who less than 24 hours ago had been in a tense confrontation, shared a table and began to talk. Their conversation started hesitantly but soon grew more animated, their hands moving as they spoke, their food largely forgotten. "I've been thinking about last night," the officer said, pushing his plate aside to lay out his folder. "The description I had, looking at it now, It was so vague it could have matched half the cars in the city. He shook his head, seeming to see the document with new eyes. Dark luxury sedan, tinted windows, male driver. The judge listened quietly, letting the officer work through his thoughts. Around them, other officers began drifting closer, drawn into the orbit of their conversation. Some found seats nearby, others leaned against walls, all listening as their colleague spoke openly about his realizations. "I've probably made hundreds of stops based on descriptions like this," the officer continued, his voice carrying a mix of confession and dawning awareness. "But sitting in that courtroom this morning, hearing those testimonies, I started counting how many of those stops involved people of color." A few of the older officers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps doing their own mental tallies. The judge noticed one veteran officer nodding slowly, his face showing the weight of similar realizations from his own career. Change often started with these small moments of honest reflection. The conversation expanded as other officers joined in, sharing their own experiences and questions. The judge mostly listened, occasionally guiding the discussion with the skill of someone used to managing complex courtroom debates. The cafeteria had become an unexpected forum for the kind of honest dialogue that rarely happened between law enforcement and the justice system. "You know what really got me?" the young officer said, pulling out his notepad. "That community elder I was sitting next to, he told me about his grandson. Honor roll student, never been in trouble, but he's been stopped 7 times this year. 7 times. Kid's only 16. He tapped his pen against the paper. That could have been my kid brother, but it never happened to him, not once." The judge watched as understanding spread across the faces around him. These weren't statistics anymore, or abstract concepts about bias and profiling. These were real stories about real people, hitting home in ways that sensitivity training and departmental memos never could. An older court clerk who had been listening spoke up, sharing her own story about her son's experiences with traffic stops. Then a bailiff added his perspective. Soon, the cafeteria hummed with voices sharing experiences that had never been spoken aloud in this space before. The young officer turned to the judge. "I get why you invited me here today," he said. "This wasn't about embarrassing me or the department. This was about seeing the bigger picture." His fingers traced the edge of his badge thoughtfully. "We're supposed to protect and serve everyone, but how can we do that if we're not even aware of our own biases?" As the lunch break neared its end, people began gathering their things and heading back to their duties. But something had shifted. The barriers that usually existed between different parts of the justice system had softened, replaced by a new understanding that they were all part of the same community. The judge stood, straightening his tie. "The real work," he said, looking around at the gathered faces, "starts when you leave this building. It's about taking these conversations back to your precincts, about questioning those snap judgments we all make, about remembering the human cost of our actions and assumptions." The young officer gathered his papers, including the vehicle description that had started it all. But now it wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a reminder of how a moment of confrontation had turned into an opportunity for growth. Sometimes the best lessons came from our biggest mistakes. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the changes it sparked were beginning to show. The young officer stood at the front of the police academy classroom, sharing his story with a new batch of recruits. The vehicle description folder, now well worn from frequent handling, sat on the podium beside him. "Before I tell you about policy and procedure," he began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found a new purpose, "I want to tell you about a night that changed how I see our job." The recruits leaned forward, drawn in by the personal nature of his introduction, rather than the usual dry training material. The classroom walls displayed new training posters, developed with input from community leaders and legal experts. One of them featured a quote from a familiar judge: "Justice isn't just about enforcing laws, it's about understanding the people we serve." The words had become something of a motto for the department's reformed training program. As the officer shared his story, he didn't try to hide his mistakes or defend his actions. Instead, he used them as teaching moments, showing how unconscious bias could affect even routine decisions. "I thought I was just doing my job that night," he explained. "But I was letting assumptions guide my actions instead of facts." In the back of the room sat 2 veteran officers who had been present in the courtroom that day 6 months ago. They nodded along, remembering how that morning's testimony had affected their own approach to policing. One of them had since become a mentor to younger officers, helping them navigate the complex relationship between law enforcement and the community. The training session wasn't just about that one night, it was about the hundreds of similar situations that happened every day. The officer shared statistics, but more importantly, he shared stories. Stories about the community elder and his grandson, about families affected by biased policing, about the human cost of snap judgments. During the break, recruits gathered around a table where community members had been invited to share their experiences. This was part of the new training approach, bringing real people with real stories into the academy, breaking down the barriers between police and the public they served. An older woman told the story of her son, a successful business owner who still got nervous every time he saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A teenage boy shared how a simple walk home from basketball practice could turn into a stressful encounter with patrol cars. These weren't accusations, they were invitations to understand. The young officer watched the interactions with satisfaction. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed these stories or gotten defensive. Now he saw them as valuable insights into the community he had sworn to protect and serve. His own story had become a bridge between two worlds that often seemed far apart. Back in the classroom, he pulled out a recent department memo. Traffic stops in minority neighborhoods had decreased, while positive community interactions had increased. But more importantly, the quality of those interactions had improved. Officers were taking time to explain their actions, to listen to concerns, to see the people behind the statistics. The judge could have filed a complaint that night, he told the recruits. He could have had my badge. Instead, he chose to show me a better way to do this job. He touched his badge thoughtfully. Now it's our turn to make that same choice every day with every person we meet. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, highlighting the eager faces of the recruits. These future officers would start their careers with something he hadn't had, an understanding that real strength in law enforcement came not from authority alone, but from empathy, understanding, and genuine community connection. As the training session wound down, one recruit raised her hand. "But how do we balance safety with fairness?" she asked. "We still need to be careful out there." The officer smiled. It was the same question he had struggled with 6 months ago. But now he had an answer that came from experience rather than fear. 1 year after the traffic stop, the courthouse steps were again filled with people, but this time for a different reason. Local news cameras captured the scene as the judge and the young officer, now promoted to community relations sergeant, stood side by side at a podium. They were there to announce a new program, one that had grown from their chance encounter that autumn night. Bridge the Gap would bring police officers into community spaces and community members into police training, creating real dialogue instead of just talking about it. "A year ago, I stopped a car based on assumptions," the sergeant told the gathered crowd, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza. That traffic stop could have been just another sad headline. Instead, it became the start of real change. He glanced at the judge, who nodded encouragingly. The program had already shown promising results in its pilot phase. Weekly community dinners where officers and residents shared meals and stories. Ride-along programs that let community members see police work from the inside. Youth mentorship partnerships that built trust between young people and law enforcement. But the real success isn't in the numbers, the judge added, stepping up to the microphone. It's in the small moments that never make the news. It's in the officer who takes time to listen instead of react. It's in the teenager who waves hello to a patrol car instead of walking the other way. In the audience, familiar faces from that transformative year looked on. The community elder who had shared his grandson's story was there, now a regular speaker at police academy sessions. The veteran officers who had witnessed the change sat among community activists they once would have seen as adversaries. The sergeant held up a familiar folder, the same one that had contained the vague vehicle description from that night. "This folder used to hold what I thought was good police work," he said. "Now it holds something more valuable, letters from community members sharing their stories, their fears, and their hopes for better relationships with law enforcement." As he spoke, a group of police academy recruits stood at attention nearby. They represented the program's next phase, a completely revamped training approach that emphasized community understanding alongside tactical skills. Their faces showed pride mixed with humility, a new generation of officers learning to serve in a different way. The judge watched them, remembering his own long journey from a young lawyer fighting against police bias to a federal judge working to bridge divides. Change doesn't always come from big movements or dramatic confrontations, he told the crowd. Sometimes it starts with one person willing to admit they were wrong and another person willing to show them a better way. After the formal announcement, people mingled on the courthouse steps, sharing stories and plans for the program's future. Officers chatted with community leaders, kids played around the courthouse columns, and the usual barriers between different parts of society seemed to fade away. The sergeant's radio crackled with routine police traffic, but it seemed less intrusive now, more like the background noise of a community working together. He turned to the judge, speaking quietly. "You know, I still think about what could have happened that night if either of us had made different choices." The judge smiled, watching a rookie officer patiently explaining his equipment to a curious group of children. "That's exactly why this program will work," he replied. "Because we all keep remembering that every interaction is a choice, every moment a chance to build trust instead of fear." As the sun began to set on the courthouse steps, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd, there was a sense of something important taking root. The story of a traffic stop gone right instead of wrong had become more than just an anecdote, it had become a blueprint for change. The lesson was simple but powerful. Real change doesn't always need grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it just needs people willing to stop, listen, and see each other as human beings first. That autumn night had proved that even the most difficult conversations could lead to understanding, if only we were brave enough to have them.